everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we will discuss on specific questions, tech regulations for EU versus US. Which approach is better? We have our world famous speaker, Professor Robin Daly. Professor Robin Daly, what you want to discuss about EU versus US? Which approach is better? Tech regulations.
Well, they're very different. With the European Union, we talk about the European Commission. With the United States, we talk about the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, both with somewhat similar missions. But the European Commission is focused like a laser on European Union citizens, about protecting their rights and assuring competition to extreme. FTC is much more reserved. I wouldn't want to say balanced because it's not really the correct term, but much more reserved. Their goal is to protect both companies and individuals, and it results in a very different dynamic. So, for instance, when the European Commission went after Microsoft in the 1990s and early 2000s, they did so with massive fines, and they forced Microsoft to change their ways. It was, I think, the Department of Justice that actually went after Microsoft in the United States, playing a similar role. And the end result was a consent decree that restricted Microsoft's movement, but not as much. I mean, that European Commission caused them to dramatically change their behavior, open up their interfaces, interoperate, make a lot of positive changes that really increase competition. On the U.S. side, Microsoft was punished, but they really weren't forced to do anything different. They came to those doing things different policies just by kind of understanding market trends and conditions and deciding they wanted to ride the wave as opposed to being buried by it. The end result means that the environment for companies and technology is much more favorable in the U.S. than it is in Europe. Though the citizens in the U.S. are more poorly protected. So the end result is, we can have a Silicon Valley in the U.S. It's pretty hard to create one in Europe because of the heavy restrictions, oversight, and regulations that such an entity would have to overcome. So the result is, in Europe, you're undoubtedly a bit safer as an individual, but in terms of economic prominence or perhaps market dominance, it's much less likely to happen in Europe than it is in the US, where people are more exposed, but companies have a far greater opportunity to expand and create individual markets and compete to almost extremes. So it's the nature of the mandate. One isn't so much better than the other unless you look at it from the perspective of the two audiences. The European Commission is better for individual safety for the citizens of the country, and the FTC is better for the strength of the country's economy, its competitive stature, but the trade-off is a higher degree of vulnerability for its citizens.
Thank you. My next question is to you. Which regulatory approach better protect consumer rights and interest in the tech industry?
Sorry, what's the last part?
Last part is, which regulatory approach better protect consumer rights and interest in the tech industry?
Well, as I mentioned, there are kind of cross purposes there. So human rights are better protected in the European Union. The European Commission is much more focused on protecting individual rights and capabilities. But when we're talking about the tech industry and protecting the industry and growing the industry itself, then we go back to the FTC and the Department of Justice. That structure is better at allowing companies to become powerful, to grow to a state of not only dominance within the country, but dominance without the country. I mean, at the end of the day, countries not only have competition internally, but there's competition between countries. Right now, the United States and China are competing pretty heavily on the industrial and technology side, and the European Union is really a major player in that competition, largely due to policies like this. On the other hand, I could still argue that the citizens of the European Union are largely safer. They don't seem to have the level of problems we have with social media and some of the other things we're experiencing here with technology being a little out of whack. that we do in the United States. Thus, that protection has a downside in terms of exposure to the individual. But from a competitive standpoint, country to country, there is no doubt that the approach that the FTC and the Department of Justice take is better for competition on a global scale. And of course, if you go to China, there's much more support for their industries over there than in the U.S., which is why they've been able to emerge as kind of the other major superpower in the world as a result.
My next question's about how do the EU and the US differ in their approach to regulating the tech companies, like big tech companies?
So the European Commission approaches a tech company almost as if they're already guilty. For the most part, the companies they go after are foreign. They're U.S. based, sometimes in other countries, but a lot of their targets have been in the United States. And so they're not conflicted. Their goal is to create a better environment for their citizens, and thus they're not necessarily at cross purposes for going after U.S. companies. U.S. companies, of course, are located here, and that does create a problem for the FTC in terms of what they can do for the country without, creating massive layoffs, competitive deficiencies against China, or one of those other things, which has a much higher concern. So the European Commission is much more effective at protecting individuals than the FTC and the Department of Justice are.
How do the data privacy law differ between EU and the US?
The EU laws are much stricter and much more strongly enforced. As again, it goes to the fact that they're not conflicted, and so that they can pass and enforce laws that go beyond what the U.S. is willing to do in terms of protecting privacy and protecting the rights of individuals. So that same thing was done here. It would probably kill a lot of the larger companies, Twitter, Facebook. Most of the U.S. social media companies would either fail or be substantially weakened if the same practice was here, and probably would move their operations overseas to avoid the regulation. And so in the end, the EU does a much better job of protecting individuals than the U.S. does.
Thank you. Which approach is more likely to encourage innovation in the tech industry?
That's where the U.S. approach is significantly higher, because the FTC has that dual requirement of not only protecting individuals but protecting the companies and the interests of the United States. For instance, when Apple tried to take out Qualcomm, it stepped in not for the betterment of the citizens of the United States. It stepped in because Qualcomm was identified as a strategic asset to the country and had to be protected. That dual mode of the FTC and the U.S. government allows the government to step in and protect companies that are seen as strategic assets, even as the FTC regulatory organization is attempting to curtail what they saw at the time as being bad behavior. By the way, it was kind of interesting to note in that particular case that much of the evidence against Qualcomm had been manufactured and wasn't accurate. It was actually Apple that was behind it all, and it's clearly much larger and stronger than Qualcomm, showcasing that they understood how to play the game and were able to use the FTC as a weapon against a much smaller competitor, which shouldn't have been the case and wasn't at all effective in the European Union and other countries. So sometimes that dual nature of the FTC gets in the way of their ability to actually curtail bad behavior. But in all cases, the structure in the United States is much more conducive to successful businesses and creating an environment where companies in the United States can successfully compete on the world stage, making the United States much stronger as a global competitor than the European Commission is for the European Union.
Thank you. My next question: what are the impact of EU Digital Service and the Digital Market Act on the best tech companies compared to US regulation?
Ask that question again. I didn't really follow.
What are the impact of EU Digital Service Act and the
Sorry, say that. Slow down. The new Digital
Service Act.
New Digital Service Act. Okay.
EU Digital Service Act.
Right.
and the Digital Market Act on big tech companies compared to US regulations?
Well, it's much stronger. These are actions the U.S. probably wouldn't take because it would be seen as curtailing business and hostile to the business environment. So it would be very hard to get that kind of regulation through of course, right now getting anything through the United States Congress is difficult, but because we're now experiencing the least productive Congress, I think, in the history of the country. But even in a good year, those kinds of acts would be seen as too restrictive on business, kind of company killers. And the end result, because of the costs and required oversight to comply and the risks of operation, those acts would likely have not passed Congress or been approved here. And yet, again, it kind of showcases the difference of the European Union. These acts do a decent job of protecting the individuals and assuring competition almost to an extreme level. And the end result is if you like competition, which of course is pretty much good for any market, except in this case when you're trying to compete with other large states like China and the U.S. It can be much more effective at curtailing the kind of behavior you want to curtail. The real trade-off really between the two environments is the U.S. environment takes much more into account this idea of competing globally and having to compete on a world stage, where the European Union is mostly contained in their activities in terms of what happens internally to the European Union. So much more sharply focused inside in terms of curtailing bad behavior, where the U.S. has a split focus, both inside and outside, which often creates conflicts that makes it very difficult for them to act. And when they do act, they can sometimes overreact. So for instance, when the United States was dominant in consumer electronics, back when RCA was the dominant player, the U.S. government stepped in, broke up RCA, and for the most part, that dominance moved to Japan. They acted too late, and then they acted too sharply, and the end result was they destroyed the business they were trying to regulate. So that's the kind of thing that can happen here due to when we reach a position of imbalance, and when the cure is sometimes, at least from the standpoint of competition and U.S. business, is worse than the disease.
Mm-hmm. Like a country like Bangladesh, India, what type of policy they should follow? The US approach, EU approach, what will be good for them? And especially, can you give some detailed example of this policy, like this US policy and USA policy?
Sure. It comes down to where you are. As you look at Bangladesh, it's a country trying to develop income and industry. And as a result, the approach that if that's the priority, then the approach should be closer to the U.S. approach than the EU approach. The EU approach, of course, already has well-developed industry, at least a significant amount of manufacturing capacity, and for whatever reason, they view safety of the individual as their primary purpose. But if you were to implement that same kind of control, all you do is make sure that businesses don't grow or develop in your country. The people would be well protected, but they'd also, to a large extent, not have the same kind of opportunities in terms of business and career that you might have in a country that wasn't so aggressively regulating. So the U.S. approach would appear to be, or some hybrid of the U.S. approach, because it's not the most efficient. I mean, you certainly, watching how it works, there would be ways to improve upon it. But an approach that would be closer to the U.S. standard, or the U.S. approach, would work better for a country attempting to build up a stronger technology and industrial base. If you're over-regulated, it's just you won't get that kind of interest that you need, and people willing to take the risk against regulation, as well as the other risks you have to take in terms of starting a business. It's just one more risk. In some ways, the Chinese approach might actually be more attractive, where the government aggressively takes into account the growth of business and aggressively invests in those business and releases regulation significantly to allow those businesses to grow. However, the downside to the Chinese approach is they have had extreme problems with pollution and employee safety, which is the trade-off that they have. So I think maybe the China approach might be a bridge too far if you care about your citizens, but perhaps a hybrid of the two, where the government aggressively supports industry, but doesn't release industry from basic regulations that assure the health and safety of the individual of the population.
Mhm. I think we have our new guest all the way. Can you introduce yourself? And do you want to share some of your experience? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Mr. Rob.
no problem.
Yeah, yeah, Mr. Rob. As these regulations and everything done by the Western world. So the policymaker, how we train the policymaker of emerging economy for learning and adapting this kind of technology uh, or technological policy. Is there any institutions in Silicon Valley, or is there any?
Well,
You know,
certainly I mean, you can go to Stanford and pick courses, but I think the best way to do it if you want to educate somebody is you send people in country, and you work within the government so that they work as aides, they work as um, folks that assist in the different regulatory bodies. In other words, they from the inside. In fact, conversely, you look at people that work for some of those regulatory bodies, and you can hire them and bring them over to debate how you should implement both strengths and weaknesses from people that have worked in these organizations as to how to do it. You also have attorneys that specialize in both supporting and fighting these regulations. Both resources are good. They have to understand how the regulatory bodies work in order to operate against or for them, and they can be incredible sources of information. And you don't necessarily have to bring them over. You just can go over there and meet with them and just ask your questions about their perspective on what's been done right, what's been done wrong. And because they've worked intimately either inside these entities or they've worked to counter or support these entities, they'll have an idea of what really might work best in your environment. And certainly, if you've got anybody that started off in Bangladesh and ended up working in one of these organizations, they would be ideal because they would understand not only what these organizations do, but they'd understand what might work in Bangladesh and what might not work, because they'd have a foundational knowledge of the structure in country, as well as an understanding of how those processes work in the various entities, the European Commission and the FTC.
Thank you. Thank you. What is the closing remarks for today's sessions, and what kind of advice you want to give this emerging economy for this kind of
Sure.
regulations? And yeah,
So neither approach is really wrong. It really kind of depends on your overall focus. For the EU, it's a focus on protecting citizen safety and rights. On the US, it's more of a balance. Between the need to protect industry and the competitiveness of the U.S., as well as protecting individuals. That's really what defines the difference. What an emerging country has to decide early on is what their priorities are. What is the priority to grow business, or is they're not mutually exclusive. And then what the balance is the priority to preserve the population. And then create a balance and understanding, and do recognize that in terms of regulating businesses in particular, there's a huge problem with regard to corruption, and so it needs to be put in place almost immediately, protections against that corruption. Make sure people are reasonably well paid, so they're not open to corruption, and make sure that they're selected in a way that the kind of people that can be corrupted, the ones that are extreme status focused folks, aren't selected for these kinds of jobs. Otherwise, you're going to build a structure that is inherently corrupt, and that has to be avoided. And in a lot of the emerging countries, corruption is a problem. So in the end, if you do this right, you can build a regulatory body that both protects businesses as they grow, but is able to step in case the businesses overstep, and protect the rights and health and safety of the individuals in the country. It's a balance that can be created, but it can only be created if you come into this as a very informed individual or group that understands the benefits and problems of each approach, can mesh the approaches for a benefit, and are focused on getting the job done and not so much focused on expanding their own wealth and capability.
Thank you, Professor Rao, for joining today's session. See you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Bye-bye.